In a book titled The Portuguese Expedition to Abyssinia in 1541 and 1543, one Whiteway takes the texts that were written by one Bermudez, who was a religious scholar embedded in the Abyssinian monarchy, and one Castanhoso, who was a Portuguese soldier who fought on the side of the Portuguese during the invasion by Ahmed Gurey into Abyssinia in early 16th century. He gives us the backdrop before he gives us the texts themselves. He gives us backdrop of what was happening. And this book was published in 1902. I need to point out that. So Whiteway writes a very long introduction where he tells us or gives us information we need to know so that we can understand the actions and activities and events that happened between 1541 and 1543. But of course, the story goes a little bit back with the invasion, especially when we are talking about that conflict. It started around 1520s when Ahmed Gurey, of course, crossed over to Abyssinia and basically conquered the entire land. Now, there is something that he tells us about the power of the Somalis, and in particular, we are talking about what they call the Zayla monarchy, or some documents call it the Adal Sultanate, and is how that sultanate managed to have this international network. Of course, in the other video I explained that the advantage that the Adal Sultanate had over the Abyssinians, particularly Ahmed Gurey had over the Abyssinians, comes down to weaponry. Somehow, Ahmed Gurey managed to get very superior weaponry from the international friends, which the Abyssinians did not have, and the Abyssinians were helpless actually when Ahmed Gurey crossed over into Abyssinia. Now, besides managing to get the armaments, Whiteway writes that also the Somalis, and Ahmed Gurey in particular, had this ability of collecting intelligence. Things were happening around them. The Portuguese were having these communications with the Abyssinians. Whiteway writes that actually the Somalis were aware of what was happening. And I'm going to read the part where he tells us about that. And he in particular describes it as the Somalis being very vigilant when it came to whatever was happening around the world. And this is what he writes. The Portuguese mission left Abyssinia in 1526, and in 1527 the Imam Hamad, surnamed Gran or Gurey, or the left-handed, began his incursion into the country. Now, before this section, Whiteway tells us about the building up of the relationship between Portugal and Abyssinia going back hundreds of years, and the communications, the embassies, and all that happening. So he's telling us that there was a particular group of ambassadors who had come to Abyssinia and stayed there for some time. They left in 1526, and almost, we could say maybe a year later, Ahmed Gurey invades. Then he continues to say, the coquettings between the Portuguese and the Abyssinians had not escaped the vigilance of Mohammedans, whose attention had been previously arrested by the early proceedings of the Europeans in India. The coquettings he's mentioning here is what he describes a very long, actually several, you could say long paragraphs he is explaining, almost a page or 2 pages, where he's explaining the relationship between Abyssinia and Portugal and the Vatican, and the communications that went between all these different entities. And he's basically saying that while all that was happening, Ahmed Gurey and his people were aware of what was happening, were aware of the communications, the sharing of information, and they had also paid close attention to what was happening in India. Remember, during this time, the Portuguese had moved to India and had established what we can call a colony, actually. And in fact, most of the activities of the Portuguese in Africa, East Africa in particular, were being coordinated actually from India. And it's not just the Portuguese, because even the colonization of Kenya happened mostly from India, not from UK. Of course, it was the British, but you get the point. So during this time, the Portuguese had gone to India, established sort of a colony there. And then most of the activities, even the coming of Christophe da Gama and his brother to Abyssinia to fight Ahmed Gurey, they came from India. So Ahmed Gurey and his people understood and had followed closely what was happening in India, especially with the Portuguese and their activities there. So they were very much aware. Anyways, this is a book that I'm still reading. I'm still at the introduction. Very interesting. It's a book I've read before and created a few videos out of it, but I've decided I'm going to read it again and create even more videos out of it. Because this book, if you are one person who wants to understand the history of the Horn of Africa very well, this is a book that you should read. This is the version of the story as told by the Portuguese, but there is also a version of the same story told by Arab Faki in the Arabic book Futu al-Habasha. So if you want to have a clear picture, I would recommend you read the two books, because Arab Faki tells the story from the perspective of course, the Adal Sultanate, and then Castanhoso and Bermudez tell the story from the perspective of the Portuguese. And Castanhoso and Bermudez were actually alive and saw some of these events. Arafaki was also sort of alive. He did not, though, accompany Ahmed Gurey into Abyssinia, but he tells us that he interviewed people who did and who were very close to Ahmed Gurey, so we can't discount his narrative because of that. Anyways, if you want to understand that conflict between Abyssinia and Adal, read Futu al-Habasha, and also read this book by Whiteway, or we could say Bermudez and Castanhoso. Check the comment section or the pinned comment or the description box or my profile bio if you are watching on TikTok to see my book reading list where you can get a link to this book. Those are my random thoughts.